In 1983, Barbra Streisand both directed and then took the lead role in a film based on a short story by Isaac Singer called Yentl. Yentl tells the story of a young Jewish girl whose father has died, who has a passion for studying the scriptures. But she lives in late 19th century Poland, and at that time it was impossible for a woman to be admitted to any type of studies of the Jewish law or the steep study of the scriptures. These were reserved only to men. And so after her father dies, and she's lost her brother as well, she decides to take her brother's name and dress like a man. This was a little easier to do in the late 19th century in Poland. And then she enters into the yeshiva, where she's going to begin her studies. Now, the rest of the film moves on about what this does as it opens up her world, but what captures my attention about it is the song. It's a Barbra Streisand film, so of course she's going to be singing. It's the song that she actually sings at the moment she walks into the yeshiva and sees the holy books and sees the men around. She's somewhat caught up in the fear that they're going to immediately recognize she's a woman. They don't. And that she's somehow going to run into trouble, but she comes immersed with everything that she says. The song really captures this. It says, there are moments you remember all your life. There are moments you wait for and dream of all your life. This is one of those moments. I will always remember this chair, that window, the way light streams in, the clothes I'm wearing, the words I'm hearing, the face I'm seeing, the feeling I'm feeling, the smell, the sounds will be written on my mind, will be written in my heart as long as I live. Well, it was one of those moments on a day thousands of years ago when, as the gospel writer tells us, Jesus was walking and, quote, passing by the Sea of Galilee. I'll stop there for a second. I've been there twice for extended time to visit. This is not something you walk past. You walk past Dave's Coffee Shop over there on the next block. You can do that in a couple of seconds. But the Sea of Galilee is enormous, and you don't just simply walk past it. How interesting that detail, though, comes out. Jesus is walking along the Sea of Galilee. When we hear it, we always just imagine this little bucolic setting with just a handful of characters, the ones that we know of, the men that are going to be called to be the apostles. But once you make your pilgrimage there, you most certainly learn that this was a bustling metropolis at the northern part of Israel. And in this particular area, the region of Galilee, the industry, the work to be done was the work of fishermen. And so there is famously Peter and his brother Andrew, later James and John, the sons of Zebedee, and the other cast of characters that will ultimately be called as Jesus' disciples. But I think it's important to point out that the seashore would have been teeming, filled with all kinds of men who were practicing the craft of fishing, so that this was not a bucolic, simple, tiny scene where a handful of people are present. We're talking about a large, boisterous crowd. And let me add one other detail. Nobody knows anybody. Now, the people that fish know each other. I don't mean that. But there's such a large number of people they can't possibly be on a first-name basis with all the people that are there. And Jesus is a stranger. He's not lived up there. He's just come to Galilee, we know, from the Judea where he's been baptized. And then the story unfolds. Mark is written in very simple prose. It's a very simple gospel. It's the first of the four that is written. Bare details, which is why I think it's interesting. In the call story for the apostles, there's very little background or detail to tell us. What did Jesus really say to them? How did they decide to follow him? Noticeably missing from the page. But they remember him walking by. They remember him asking them to follow them. They remember him saying, "Come, and I will make you fishers of men," a phrase that has been replayed all the way down to this age. They remembered that. They remembered that they came over, got James and John, and they remembered that interesting detail that they left their father Zebedee with the hired hands in the boat to go follow Jesus. Not given to us was, why did they do that? What was it that was compelling? What was it that drew them? The point of the story is to simply say they recognized they had been called. And there are other accounts of this calling where rather clear they will say that we've seen the Messiah. In one of them, John the Baptist actually announces it. That's the one that we occurred last week. But nevertheless, these apostles are not going to instantly recognize the Messiah. They're going to have to do the same thing you and I have done with God, which is go through our entire adult lives, always trying to get a little closer, always trying to figure out the mystery a little more. And to be boldly honest with you, we almost never get close enough. We can't really figure all of that out. The apostles are in that same mold, but they know that God has called them. That's the one thing that they know. Now, the last detail about the disciples' call I want to share with you is that the Gospel of Mark was written in the 5th decade, right after Paul finished his letters. And so a number of decades, literally 20 to 30 years, have gone by from when the actual live events took place. And so the people writing them were acutely aware of what had happened. Remember, Mark is written in light of the resurrection, in light of the ascension. It's the story of Jesus Christ, you see. But the idea that they recognized him immediately, that he announced himself immediately, is foolish. That's not what happens. And in the same way that you and I have to go through a process that's frequently annoying, always challenging, and very difficult, we also have to recognize that we've been called by God. It's wonderful when we have some recognition of the path that we're on. You might say, as Yentl would say, this is one of those moments. As a priest, I have prepared couples for marriage for over 22 years now, and a staple of my marriage preparation with my couples is that the first of the 3 meetings, it's primarily introductory, learning about the families they come from, the relationships they've seen, different aspects. The climax of that first meeting is always the question, tell me, how did you meet? And over 22 years, I've heard hundreds of different meeting stories, all kinds of ones, some quite memorable, many not so memorable. A good number of people meet online, and it's interesting now, because that's been a recent development the last 3 or 4 years, that when you really probe about, well, how did you meet? Well, you know more about this than I do. The mechanics of the online process gets in the way of somewhat of the story, but I always tell them afterwards. Another couple I spoke with just Wednesday at our first meeting, went through the online piece, is that none of this matters till you actually really meet and decide you want to be with each other. And let's start there. Where did you go? So you see that most couples at least know their meeting story. And the interesting thing about the meeting story is the same thing that appeared to me about those disciples fishing on the Sea of Galilee like they did every day of their lives, is the utter ordinariness of it, the utter normality of it, the almost banality of it. If you were an artist or someone trying to write beautiful prose, trying to come up with a really nice storybook scene. In a Hollywood directed film, there'd have to be some drama there because it just doesn't play that well. It's so vanilla. But I'm struck by it, that in the most ordinary setting, in the most ordinary of places, the most ordinary of people, the Son of God is revealing himself and saying, repent and believe the gospel. The kingdom of God is at hand, which is the central message of the Gospel of Mark that we'll be hearing this entire year. I've thought about some of my own meeting stories. Most of us, I've always thought about this, can remember our really good childhood friendships, and most of mine, I can't really remember how they began. One was the next door neighbor, but I don't remember when we moved into the house where he became the next door neighbor. It's like we just simply always were friends, but that's not possible. It had to be some beginning. My college roommate, who's still a good friend of mine, we met in the 4th grade when I moved. That's always a traumatic event. We're child's the only time I moved like that. And at the age of 10, in the middle of the 4th grade, we met on the playground that very first day in the new school. We've remained wonderful friends since. But about that meeting, I remember almost next to nothing else. I'm a little bit better with one of the more important moments in my life in July of 1984 when I met Michael for the first time. I remember the setting well. It was somebody's house in Bloomington. I couldn't find it if my life depended on it. It's just somewhere in Bloomington. And it was a cold night, even though it was July, and I had to wear a long sleeve shirt. I remember that. And I remember there being lots of people because it was a boisterous party. And of course, any party I'm going to, drinking was going on, which I completely approve of. And so I remember that. And I remember meeting Michael. I remember having a conversation and deciding we wanted to somehow continue to pursue that relationship. The rest of it is lost in the mist of my mind. Only when I look back, only when I try to see the beginning, only when I see how did this happen, was I beginning to understand that that was one of those moments. just like Yentl was saying. You see, it's not always in the moment like she does conveniently in the film that we recognize this is the moment. This is the wonderful thing about memory. Memory allows us to suddenly come, sometimes through deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning, to the conclusion that there was a real fixed beginning that we just simply weren't aware of. 22 years of meeting stories and 22 years of confessions have told me the very same thing, that awareness increases over time, that it's not always there in that immediate moment. And I'm struck once again by the utter ordinariness of it. My watch said I didn't get this, listen to me. We didn't expect that God would call us. No one expects that. The apostles weren't expecting that. And when you think about who he would call, why an ordinary fisherman? Why not someone with education? All of this would make sense. That Israel was filled in the temple with people who had studied the law for decades, who would really benefit on a high level from what Jesus had to say. But notice his interest. He didn't just was disdainful of them. He just simply chose to call absolutely, utterly, totally, completely, conspicuously ordinary people. Isn't that interesting? Because even in our most fundamental relationships, where we can't remember how they began, what they don't begin is with a lot of air of intentionality. Somebody searching for a friend, somebody searching for someone that's going to become their life partner or their spouse, or anything of that sort. That is revealed over a period of time as they go back and look at all of that. And the circumstances in which meeting happens seem so ordinary, so accidental, so almost coincidental, you could miss how beautifully the hand of God is working. And so in Eucharist, we can always recognize this mystery that's so hard for us to grasp. And yes, this is one of those moments. Tonight, as we gather together for Eucharist, we gather for an important moment. You see, the moment that the apostles shared with Jesus on the beach is no different than the moment you and I shared with him the day we were conceived. We don't remember it. Jesus does. Jeremiah says that he knew us before we were conceived in our own mother's womb. And so that we recapture that moment when we come into existence. You see, that is a significant, a profound moment willed by God. In other words, with all the majesty of the universe and all the different things, the variety, the diversity, all the things that you and I notice in contrast to our utter ordinariness, that we notice all of that, that God looks at us, maybe the way we see ourselves, utterly, totally, completely, conspicuously ordinary, and he says, the universe needs one of you too. You see, that's the whole way that God accesses us, and it's different for us. You see, for many people, it's the idea that God must be distant. God doesn't sin. He's all-knowing. He's all-powerful. That eye that's looking down on us. For many people, they keep their distance from such a God, hoping that he doesn't see their faults, doesn't see their weaknesses, doesn't see their disappointments, and they want to put on their very best face when they come to see him. One of the teaching things I use when I teach the Mass is the idea that if we invited the Pope, now this isn't going to happen, but if we invited the Pope and he came to St. James Church and we didn't have all this social distancing and the rules that we have, this church would be filled with people and probably none of them would be parish members. The more influential people who gave more money are somehow going to find their way into here. They'll let Pip play the organ, but they won't like it. They're going to still want all of the other spaces in the church. That's the air of celebrity, you see, that is there. And I understand that. But you see, in Eucharist, there really is only one celebrity, only one celebrant, and that is Jesus. Don't you see? So when we gather together to pray together, we are having a moment with the Lord. That's what it is. A moment, a real moment where heaven is wedded to earth. That's the central thesis of the Eucharist. And that we don't leave this earth like we're ascending. That would be bizarre. We're not people that believe in the rapture. That's not what we do. But when we come forward from communion, we are receiving bread that has come from heaven. We're receiving the Lord himself, the same God who knew us the moment we were created, the same God who called us at our baptism, and the same God that continues to call us in the ordinariness of our life. And here's the way you and I have our moment. First of all, the consecration at the altar. I wanted to mention that briefly. The consecration at the altar uses an ancient formula. The formula, the words, "Take this, all of you, and eat of it. This is my body, which will be given up to you," the similar words over the chalice. These are word-for-word translations of what Jesus said to the disciples at the Last Supper. You see, on most of the scripture stories, particularly Mark, there's such an absence of detail. But when it came down to what did Jesus say at the Last Supper, words that have been preserved all the way down for our liturgy this evening, they knew that this was one of those moments. They knew these words had to be remembered. They knew these words would transform so far beyond their imagination. They knew that, and that's why those words are written down, and we have our moment when we hear those words spoken again. And then, of course, we have our other interior personal moment as we prepare ourselves to come forward to receive Holy Communion. You and I must, as a part of the ritual, say, Lord, I am not worthy to receive you, for have you enter under my roof. And only if you say the word, your will be done. We all say that. Note the importance there, that Jesus, he doesn't really demand it. The liturgy demands us to admit our ordinariness, to admit our weakness, to admit our deficiency, to admit our faults, to actually put it out there on the table. The worst we can possibly do. We don't want to do that. We put on our best. We try to think the best when we're doing it. And I know, because I work with people, particularly in confession, some people struggle with communion because they know they've sinned. I said, but the two are meant to go together. You see, it's the act of mercy that comes in Holy Communion that helps release you from the bondage of sin in the same way specifically announced in the confessional. It is one of those moments. So you see, the part that we want to hide, the part that we don't want to reveal, the part that we're ashamed of, maybe we're not ready yet. If we had a little bit more time, cook in the crock pot a little bit longer, wait till I get my affairs in order to do this, that, or the other thing. All that procrastination about when we might find ourselves at the right moment to meet the Lord, we come to Eucharist and all of that flies out these beautiful windows. And here we are, whether we're ready or not, we come to meet him. And we have to bear loose all of our weaknesses. What does he do? He takes every one of those weaknesses and gives us his perfection again and again and again. My goodness, how many times does God have to bless us to get us out of our low self-esteem? How many times can we recognize that wherever we are in our journey, wherever we are in our life, whatever struggles we're having, whatever difficulties we're having, that in spite of all of those things, that is the moment God is ready to meet us. He's not ready for later. He's not ready for when things get better. He's not ready for when we think we improve our situation, look a little bit better doing that. He's here tonight in the here and the now, and every time the churches celebrate Eucharist, every time they have done, in an unbroken tradition since that very first Easter night. The beauty of liturgy is that it creates the moment. You know, the moment that God reveals himself to us, that we are called, that we're precious to him, that one day he wishes to receive us with his heavenly grace. His grace is only he can bestow, and it can only come when we exchange our weakness for them. We get to rehearse that. That's what we do every time we come to Eucharist. Rehearse what will happen at the final judgment, when we will trade for the last time all of our deficiencies, all of our sadness, all of our sorrows, and receive utterly, totally, completely, conspicuously eternal grace. There are moments you remember all your life. There are moments you wait for and dream of all your life. This is one of those moments.